Welcome to Newswatch. This week, viewers ask why royal tours hardly ever make the news, and the controversy over poor pronunciation, or should that be controversy? The Queen's tour of Canada ended last week. What tour is that, some of you have been asking, because there was hardly anything on the main news bulletins. During the 9-day royal visit, there were 2 filmed reports and a handful of short mentions. To be fair, Breakfast and News 24 carried a few pieces, but some of you felt short-changed. Here's what Patrick Keogh had to say.
I don't understand why the BBC seems to think that this is of no interest to the people of this country. The Queen is our head of state. This is a monarchy. We are not a people's republic. To my mind, seeing as how the BBC will follow a group of ball kickers, the end of the universe, in depth, whereas the Queen, the monarch, our head of state, can travel to our oldest dominion and be completely ignored by the BBC.
In the past, news bulletins would cover foreign tours in great detail, like this 1961 visit to India. Of course, times have changed, but some of you think coverage these days can be very cursory. Like the 12 seconds given to the Canadian tour on the 1 o'clock news one day last week. And what really angered viewer Virginia Cecil was that plenty of time was found immediately afterwards for a story about a gorilla at Bristol Zoo. She wrote, "Is our head of state really considered by the BBC less important than a monkey?" John Williams is Home News Editor. John Williams, why so little apparently from this royal visit on the main bulletins?
One of the issues for us was that Western Canada, where the Queen was visiting, is 7 hours behind London. And that's why quite a lot of the coverage made it onto Breakfast, and 2 pieces did make it onto the 1 o'clock news. But that's principally the reason why, and I ought to point out that the BBC was the only broadcast organisation to actually travel with the Queen. None of our competitors actually went to Canada.
Has the nature of royal coverage changed, and how much has it changed? Has there got to be a story or another story, like a demonstration, to justify extensive coverage these days?
I don't think there has to be a demonstration, but clearly there has to be a story, and I think we have to apply the same news values to the coverage of the royal family that we apply to anything else. I think inevitably the nature of the coverage has changed. I think it's changed in society in general in terms of deference, and I think we don't simply report the royal family because they're there, as the BBC and other organisations might once have done. We are driven by news values. But as I say, there has been quite a lot of coverage of the royal family over the last few years, and I suspect actually the royal family would rather that the stories dropped out of the headlines rather than the broadcasters.
And there are indeed some stories they could have done without, I'm sure. But what about our viewers' comment that a gorilla in a zoo got more coverage than the royal visit?
Well, I'm not going to defend the individual item. All I would say is that the gorilla in itself was not uninteresting. It was the first time that the animal had a successful cataract operation. Those are decisions for individual program editors to make. In terms of royal coverage, we have covered the Queen. We did go with Prince Charles to Australia and to New Zealand earlier this year, and I've no doubt that at the point at which Prince Charles takes Camilla on the first visit overseas, we'll also cover that.
Is there a case that perhaps the BBC is getting a bit too blasé about royal visits? For instance, the state visit to France last year got blanket coverage on French television, but nothing near like it in British television.
I'm sorry to go head-to-head with you, Ray, but actually the coverage in France and in Germany in November got extensive coverage. Nicholas Witchell went with the Queen and was on the 6 o'clock news and the 10 o'clock news most nights, not least because the Queen delighted an audience in front of President Chirac speaking French. There was lots of coverage of the trip to France. There was lots of coverage of the trip to Germany. I'm sorry that the viewer watched the 1 o'clock news and didn't see it. Inevitably, because of the time difference, as I say, the visit to Canada ends up being edged out by rather fresher material.
Do you think viewers got good value for money for all the sending people there, and compared with what actually appeared on the screen and main bulletins?
I think 6 pieces in the space of 8 days does provide value for money, but you hit on an interesting point that actually we have to judge the merit of the story before we send people. It wasn't only June that went. There was a producer, there was a camera crew, that also went. And it's important to us as custodians of the license fee that actually we are going to deploy on the stories that provide the best value for money. In this case, actually providing 6 pieces in 8 days, I think it did that.
John Williams, thank you very much indeed. An item in Breakfast this week reported that as a nation we're saving less money, preferring to spend it on luxuries.
Well, I'm certainly doing my bit to save money. Out of the window goes a posh cup of coffee, £2, packet of smoked salmon sandwiches, £2.70, and my own personal indulgence, cookie dough ice cream, £3.70. Honestly, the sacrifices we have to make.
That prompted a dozen people to call in, not about the content of the piece, but complaining that the reporter was setting a bad example by littering. It was unnecessary and disgusting, they said, even illegal, according to one caller. I can't believe you've actually done this in the news, said Valerie Mallon. It's not a very good influence on children. This is the sort of thing people are told not to do. And even those of you who appreciated it was done for effect still felt it created a bad impression. The referendums in France and the Netherlands have raised many questions. One of them is, why does the BBC use referendums and not referenda? Matthew Osborne wrote, if you're cutting back on staff in news, you could start with the journalists who don't know how to use English.
Referendums. Referenda.
Referending.
Referendum.
Referendums.
In fact, the BBC told us both referendums and referenda are fine, though the English referendums seems preferable to the Latin. But some organisations, including Parliament, use only referendums, which is also the preferred choice of the Oxford English Dictionary. Staying with words, sometimes it's not what you say, but the way that you say it. And the question of how words are pronounced is one that vexes many viewers. Privacy or privacy? Schedule or schedule? Harass or harass? And when it comes to proper nouns, that's a whole different matter, says viewer Tim Gosling.
I've been concerned for a long while about the BBC's image abroad, in the sense that it so often fails to pronounce foreign names correctly, and I think this is slightly impolite, to say the least. One of the most common ones is undoubtedly Vladimir instead of Vladimir.
The Russian President Vladimir Putin has promised...
Milosevic was one that gave people a lot of problems and came out of Milosevic about half the time.
The trial of the former Yugoslav president, Slobodan Milosevic, could be...
Lino Gwent was coming up in the election quite frequently.
Lino Gwent had been Labour's safest Welsh seat.
Well, now I'm hoping to have a good look at the pronunciation unit and see exactly how it works.
Hello.
Pleased to meet you. What I'm interested in is where you get the pronunciations from.
We speak a number of languages within the unit. We have, as you can see, a lot of dictionaries and reference books here that often answer the question. We have a wonderful resource within the BBC in that the World Service staff and the staff in BBC Monitoring in Caversham, we have people who speak hundreds of different languages, native speakers. With news, we do try and do a few things that are to anticipate the questions that will come up. We do special lists for things like general elections, of constituency names, candidate names and so on. We do lists for sporting events, Wimbledon, the Euro 2004. They'll look up the pronunciation online. They'll be able to see the modified spelling, which is this phonetic spelling, which is based on English spelling and sound, so fairly easy to use. They'll also be able to hear a synthesizer, which is automatically generated.
Vladimir Putin. Jose Mourinho.
How strongly can you persuade newsreaders and things to use your service? I mean, do they have to be persuaded?
We don't have the power to enforce. You couldn't possibly make somebody say something in a particular way. We do all we can to encourage uptake of the service that we're providing, but I think ultimately if a programme decides that it's always going to follow our advice, that's something that's going to be decided upon by the editor of the programme and carried out by the people working on the programme.
Shabina Begum has won her legal battle to wear a full-length traditional Muslim dress to school.
I've been down to the pronunciation unit, and what I'm trying to find out from this end is how you use them. I mean, how often do you consult them?
I use them a lot, actually. I mean, I probably use them nearly every day. I don't tend to ring them until about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. and I often do ring them because we have the system, which I know you've seen already, where you can look at them up online. But I quite like to just hear it from the horse's mouth, as it were, and then I can write it down phonetically. So they tell me how to pronounce it, I write it down, and I write it straight into my script. So when it comes up on the auto cue at 6 o'clock, I know I've written it in and I know exactly how to say it.
I think you care more about it than some people, to be honest.
I do care about it. I mean, that's my job, of course I do, and I've got to get it right, and I know how infuriating it is if you're sitting there watching television and somebody says a word completely wrong, when you know how it should be pronounced. But I'm sure I care about it even more because I'm a linguist and because I hear words mispronounced all the time. It's not a question of being beneath somebody's dignity or not bothered. I just think words become accepted in our everyday language.
I have to say I'm very impressed with the pronunciation unit and the work they do. They seem to go to a lot of trouble to collect correct pronunciations from all over the place, and they have made what I hope to see, which is a pronouncing dictionary, which is accessible from everywhere in the BBC. The problem now, I think, is a cultural one of persuading newsreaders, journalists, reporters to use the dictionary properly and not to regard it as too much of a problem to do so.
If, like Tim Gosling, you want to comment on any news or current affairs programmes on BBC TV, you can call us on 0870 010 6676 or email newswatch@bbc.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Now tell us what's on your mind.